Now, it is a great pleasure for me to introduce to you USC Distinguished Professor Emerita, Dr. Marjorie J. Spruill. She is no stranger in our midst. So many of us know Marjorie and have worked with Marjorie, our friends or colleagues, to many of us who are here today. Dr. Spruill is a former member of the Society's Executive Council and currently represents the South Caroliniana Society on the South Carolina Archives and History Commission and has a license tag to prove it. During her tenure as a teaching faculty member at USC, Dr. Spruill was a great supporter and a user of the South Caroliniana Library, and she saw to it that her students were too. Dr. Spruill is widely known and respected for her work on women and politics, from the women's suffrage movement to the present. She is the author or editor of 6 books on women's suffrage, including One Woman, One Vote, Rediscovering the Women's Suffrage Movement. Earlier, she published a 3-volume anthology co-edited with Val Littlefield and Joan Marie Johnson entitled South Carolina Women, Their Lives and Times. Dr. Spruill is eminently qualified to speak on the role of the South in women's suffrage. And so, Marjorie, we are delighted that you agreed to accept our invitation to come and speak to us today.
Thank you very much for the kind invitation and for that kind introduction. And again, it's so great to actually see you and to see you in person. Some of you I haven't seen for a long time. And in fact, I haven't seen just about anybody for a year, have you? We've all been isolated, and it's a great thing to get together on this beautiful day. I'm pleased to have the opportunity to talk to you about how our suffragist foremothers fought and won the right to vote for themselves and American women through the 19th Amendment. I'm also planning to discuss how our forefathers, especially those in the southern states, fought so hard to keep that from happening, and about the role of race and racism in the story, which was huge. Fair warning, some South Carolina politicians and historical figures, most notably Governor and Senator Benjamin Tillman, don't come off well in this story. I am choosing, however, to focus on the positive, and that being the actions of the women of the state, many of whom make that really easy to do. At 3 crucial periods of the suffrage movement's history, South Carolina women were in the lead, and I mean at the national as well as state levels. And you can see this in this wonderful 3-part series that the great Beryl Dacres, our new fearless leader, has worked so hard on over the past year. Researching diligently, meticulously, including in the South Caroliniana collections, writing and producing it. And I have been really proud to have been part of that series along with other historians in the state, and I have learned so much from Beryl and from these others. Even after you tell them everything that you know and it's on screen, she still found so much else that I didn't know, that I just learned so much from watching these. And 2 of them have already been out, and the 3rd one is going to be coming out later this month. So it's called Sisterhood, South Carolina Suffragist, and you can find it on your website as well if you want to catch up on the ones you missed. Highly recommend it. I'll be giving you just a taste of what is in the new edition of my book, One Woman, One Vote, Rediscovering the Women's Suffrage Movement, which I have just finished. I mean, just. The presses are about to roll, and It's going to be mailed out in mid-June, and it's already available for pre-order. The new edition is a revised and expanded, greatly expanded, almost twice as big, of a book I did for the 75th anniversary of the suffrage amendment. And it was originally the companion volume to a PBS documentary, One Woman, One Vote. And it is expanded now to include not just the over 100-year fight for the vote, but also the first 100 years of women as voters, and goes right up through the 2020 election, in which, as we know, women played a crucial role as voters, as organizers, and as candidates. And it has almost 200 photos, which is remarkable, especially since the book cost $1 more than it did 25 years ago, and it wasn't much then. So we've been working hard at that. And we also, if you want to be so generous as to give one to your public library or high school library or university library, we've come out this time with a library edition. So commercial over, let me begin. The women's suffrage movement began in the northeastern United States in the context of antebellum reform. Many women began speaking out for women's rights when their efforts to participate fully in the great reforms of the day, most notably the movement to end slavery, were severely criticized as inappropriate for their sex. You may know that Sarah and Angelina Grimke, born in Charleston, were among the first to raise the issue of women's rights, and they did so after being severely criticized for speaking against slavery in public settings. The Grimke sisters were 2 of 14 children in a prominent slaveholding family who left their privileged existence to live among Quakers in the North because of their abhorrence of slavery. When their lectures began to attract huge audiences that included men, the Grimkes encountered tremendous criticism, including from ministers, congregational ministers who denounced them for assuming, quote, the place and tone of man as public reformer, unquote, and barred them from speaking in their churches. Angeline also attracted a lot of attention, both positive and negative, in 1836, when she published this Appeal to the Christian Women of the South, in which she sought to persuade and push them to act against slavery. It was publicly burned outside the Customs House in Charleston, along with other anti-slavery literature. Their mother was warned that the sisters would be arrested if they ever tried to return to the city. Both sisters wrote on women's rights. In 1837, Sarah Grimke published Letters on the Equality of the Sexes, from which Ruth Bader Ginsburg quoted in her first Supreme Court case, Frontiero versus Richardson, in 1973. And as we have mourned her loss, we've frequently heard this quotation: I ask no favors for my sex. All I ask of our brethren is that they will take their feet from off our necks and permit us to stand upright. The home where the sisters grew up still exists. It's now a law office on East Bay. That plaque went up in 1915. In fact, many people in Charleston first became aware of the sisters after publication of the popular historical novel by Sue Monk Kidd, seen there on the right with Mayor Riley, and the book called The Invention of Wings. Next step, I hope a Grimke sister statue would be nice. In recent years, the Grimke sisters are not only honored in Charleston, but they're studied in South Carolina schools. Here you see me with 4 8th graders who had interviewed me in March of that year for their History Day project on the Grimkes, for which they won an award. And I think that I was at least as proud as their teacher or parents on that particular occasion. The women who set the women's rights movement in action by calling for the Seneca Falls Convention, Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott, also ran into difficulties participating in the anti-slavery movement. They first met in London, where they had gone for a World Anti-Slavery Convention, only to find that women were excluded from the proceedings. In 1848, they put out the call for the conference in Seneca Falls, New York, where participants voted to demand the right to vote. This was the first formal demand for women's suffrage. It was part of a declaration of sentiments demanding a wide range of reforms, from married women's property rights to the right to equal education and employment to freedom from domestic violence. Interestingly, some of the participants thought that demanding women's suffrage was way too radical, and only the powerful urging of Elizabeth Cady Stanton and the formerly enslaved famous anti-slavery orator Frederick Douglass convinced them to include it. Many participants wouldn't sign. Two other women who became prominent leaders of the women's suffrage movement, Susan B. Anthony and Lucy Stone, were not at Seneca Falls, but quickly became involved in the movement. From the beginning, the women's movement was an interracial movement. Sojourner Truth, who had escaped from slavery in New York, became one of the star orators of the women's rights and the anti-slavery movements, best known for her speech, "Ain't I a Woman?" Unlike Sojourner Truth, most of the African American women active in the women's movement in these years were middle-class women who had been born free. These included Harriet Forton Purvis, seen here in the middle, who was active in the Underground Railroad as well as in women's rights, Frances Harper, abolitionist, suffragist, poet, teacher, public speaker, and writer. Sarah Remond at Left became an international activist for human rights and women's suffrage. During the Civil War, white and black women's rights advocates focused on making it a war to free the slaves. They formed the Women's National Loyal League, through which they gathered signatures on petitions for a constitutional amendment to abolish slavery. When the war ended, the women's movement began to focus more and more on gaining the vote, but not just for themselves. Their goal was universal suffrage for all. Though the Constitution had left decisions about requiring voting to the states, during Reconstruction, there was a lot of talk about amending the Constitution to protect newly emancipated African Americans, to give them the vote so that they had the power to protect themselves. It was also important, of course, for political reasons, to Republicans controlling Congress to have support in the South, and thus to continue to hold power and complete the job of Reconstruction. The 14th Amendment declared African Americans to be citizens and with the right to vote. The 15th reiterated that they had the vote, but nowhere in either amendment was women's right to vote, black or white, recognized or protected. In fact, in the enforcement clause of the 14th Amendment, the section which declared that a state's congressional representation would be cut if it denied male citizens the vote on account of race, the word male was added to the Constitution for the first time ever. With racial prejudice strong in the North and the West, as well as in the South, advocates for these amendments knew that it was going to be hard to get the requisite number of states, which, as you know, is 3/4, to extend the vote to black men. Adding women's suffrage, most of these men concluded, would make that task impossible. Even Frederick Douglass begged the suffragists to understand. It was, they said, a term that was coined by Wendell Phillips, the Negro's hour. The woman's hour, they said, would soon come. The issue of what to do tore the women's movement apart. In 1869, suffragists divided into two factions over whether to support ratification of the 15th Amendment and how to go about winning the vote for women. The National, led by Stanton and Anthony, refused to support it, and the American Woman Suffrage Association, led by Lucy Stone and her husband Henry Blackwell, supported it, with Stone saying at least somebody would get out of this terrible pit. Naturally, the AWSA attracted more African American affiliates. These included the Rollins Sisters of South Carolina, some of the few women in the South who openly worked for women's suffrage in these years. Fascinating people, the subject of Verrill's second documentary. They were descendants of immigrants who fled from Saint-Domingue Revolution in the late 18th century. They were free people of color living prosperously in Charleston, South Carolina during the era of slavery. Before the Civil War, the sisters, Frances, Charlotte, or Lottie, Catherine, Kate, and Louise, and their younger sister, Florence, lived in Charleston on America Street with their parents, William and Margaretta Rollin. Their father was a devoted Catholic who operated a prosperous lumber business. The girls attended private Catholic schools in Charleston, and the three oldest girls were sent to the Institute for Colored Youth in Philadelphia for secondary education. Early on, it was clear that these were proud women who would stand up for their rights and for those of other African Americans. In 1867, Frances, the eldest of the daughters, filed a complaint with the Freedmen's Bureau against the captain of a steamer, the pilot boy, for refusing her first-class accommodations for a trip to Beaufort. She won. He was given a hefty fine and ordered to cease discrimination. She soon met Major Martin Delaney, the Union Army's highest-ranking black commissioned officer, who commissioned her to write his biography. She moved to Boston to work on that and published the book under her nickname, Frank Rollin, in 1868. Living in Boston, she enjoyed its many political and cultural attractions and was courted, by the way, by many, including Harvard student Richard Greener. I think he's a familiar name around these parts and a familiar figure thanks to the statue erected not long ago, who would later come to USC as a young professor and become the librarian at the South Caroliniana Library. Meanwhile, Catherine and Charlotte, or Lottie, established a freedmen's school in Charleston. But by 1869, they had moved to Columbia and had jobs as clerks in the State House. In Columbia, the Rollins sisters were strong supporters of women's suffrage and well situated to promote it. Lottie, Kate, and Louisa Rollin turned their home into a salon where movers and shakers and Reconstruction-era politics gathered. You can learn all about them on Beryl Dacre's documentary and on the historic Columbia site, City of Women. The house was located very close to where we stand right now, at the southeastern corner of Senate and Sumter Streets. As a reporter for the New York Sun wrote in 1871, and I quote, "Their house is a kind of Republican headquarters. They entertain very handsomely. The government meets at the Rollin House almost nightly, and in the parlors of that mansion, much of the wisdom which controls our affairs is generated," unquote. Reporters gushed over their beauty, social skills, and political sophistication, calling them the queens of the South. And Beryl, I don't know where the picture did not exist, so you must have had it painted, right? Is that right? That's wonderful. Frances married one of the leading politicians in the state, a legislator from Beaufort, William J. Whipper, who promoted women's suffrage as a delegate to the 1868 South Carolina Constitutional Convention. In 1869, Lottie addressed the state legislature on behalf of women's suffrage, insisting that, quote, "public opinion has had a tendency to limit women's sphere to too small a circle." And she asked for suffrage, quote, "not as a favor, not as a privilege, but as a right," unquote. In 1870, the Rollins held a women's rights convention in Columbia, attended by some of the state's most influential male Republicans, black and white. With Lucy Stone's encouragement, in 1871, the sisters established a state suffrage organization affiliated with the American Woman Suffrage Association, with Lottie Rollin representing South Carolina as an ex officio member of the AWSA Executive Committee. Now, I don't want to get too far into the weeds, legally speaking here, but let me explain this, that in the 1870s, the National Woman Suffrage Association tried what was called a new departure, a bold move, seeking victory through the courts. Their plan was to show up before registrars and at the polls and try to vote. If they succeed, perhaps be arrested, but the goal was to make their trial a test case for the idea that the 14th Amendment, if you exclude that pesky enforcement clause, just said citizens, and it enfranchised all citizens, and women were citizens. Following this strategy in the early 1870s, hundreds of women tried to vote, though most were turned away. In Hyde Park, Massachusetts, where the Grimke sisters were now living, a group of 42 women, led by the Grimke sisters, made their way through a heavy snowstorm seeking to cast their votes. In 1872, Anthony actually managed to intimidate some local registrars and cast a vote in Rochester, New York, again hoping to be arrested to take her case all the way to the Supreme Court. She was arrested and indicted for, quote, knowingly, wrongfully, and unlawfully voting for a representative to the Congress of the United States, unquote. Found guilty and fined, she insisted she would never pay $1 of it. To her great disappointment, her case did not progress further. Something about her lawyer, thinking it would be such a shame for a nice lady like Miss Anthony to go to jail, and paid the fine without her permission. In another case, 2 years later, suffragist Virginia Minor of St. Louis, Missouri, managed to get the issue before the Supreme Court. But the court ruled unanimously that citizenship did not automatically confer the right to vote, and that the 14th Amendment did not prevent any state from excluding women. So, suffragists then sought a new constitutional amendment, worded similarly to the 15th, but specifically enfranchising or protecting women against discrimination. They hoped it would be the next amendment. They hoped it would become the 16th Amendment, but obviously it didn't, because at first they got almost no support. The strategy having failed, it was clear that there would be no quick federal solution to gaining the vote for women. Unlike other nations that instead of the federal system that we have, one that has one ruling body or one parliament, in America, women would have to persuade every state to enfranchise women, or get enough states that they could amend the Constitution to protect women's rights, which would have the effect of overruling the states which had not enfranchised women. And that would take another half a century. Later, after the 1920 victory, the suffragists added it all up, and they found that between the Civil War and the victory of the 19th Amendment in 1920, they had been forced to conduct, and I won't read this slide, but you get the idea, hundreds of campaigns of all types before that final 1920 victory. Okay, so begs the question, why was that so hard? Why was getting a federal amendment so difficult? The Founding Fathers did that on purpose. They made it deliberately difficult to add to our nation's foundational document. Though they intended for it to be a flexible document for additions to be possible, they also wanted to prevent any revisions or additions that lacked strong support from across the nation. Therefore, to succeed, an amendment had to have the approval of 2/3 of each House of Congress and then 3/4 of the states. As it turned out, there was a clear regional pattern to the success of women's suffrage. As we have heard, it started in the Northeast, But its first successes came in the West, and its biggest problems were in the South. In the 1800s, 4 Western states, marked here with gold stars, adopted women's suffrage, starting with Wyoming, which did so in 1869 while still a territory. Utah followed a year later in 1870 as a territory. In both cases, politicians in these states had seen women's suffrage as advantageous. In Wyoming, very sparsely populated, they hoped to attract more settlers, not just by making it seem attractive to female migrants, but as a marketing gimmick to draw attention to the territory. And in Utah, Mormon leaders were motivated by hopes of convincing Congress that it was okay to continue to practice polygamy, which Congress was thinking about abolishing. They were hoping to show that Mormon women were not just downtrodden. And their other motive was to try to gain some advantage in their ongoing power struggle with non-Mormons in Utah Territory, miners and cowboys, railroad workers who tended not to have women with them. Colorado and Idaho did this, adopted women's suffrage after becoming states during the 1890s, as the suffragists forged alliances with populists and the free silver movement, etc. Suffragists were learning that in order to win, that they must convince politicians not just of the justice of women's suffrage, but that it could benefit the politicians in some way, that an expediency argument was always going to be necessary. Later, after 1910, the next wave of victories would come from the West, but many states in the East, and especially the South, continued to resist. Most of the northeastern states, at least, would ratify when it finally got to them in 1919, but the South was the biggest problem and remained the biggest problem for the women's movement. And in 1920, when the 19th Amendment was finally ratified, 9 of the 10 states that refused to ratify were south of the Mason-Dixon line. The movement just had gotten almost nowhere in the South. After reuniting in 1890, the AWSA, the NWSA came together in the National American Woman Suffrage Association, which I shall hereafter refer to as the National. They united under Anthony's leadership in one major organization that would lead the movement to victory after 3 more decades of fighting. Anthony's strategy was this: focus on only one goal, gaining the vote for women. With the vote, she reasoned, they could then pursue additional reforms. To win, they would make concessions to the political realities of the United States during an era which was one of the worst in the history of American race relations, a period in which white conservatives in the South were determined to reassert and maintain white supremacy in politics and were using protection of white womanhood as a rationalization for disfranchising black men. As the ultimate goal remained a federal amendment, they could not just write off the South. They had to have at least some southern states. Laura Clay of Kentucky, one of the earliest and most prominent suffrage leaders in the southern states, warned the National, you can work for 50 more years and get nowhere unless you bring in the South. My first book was on this subject, the suffrage movement in the South. The key issue, again, was race. White Southern conservatives already hated the suffrage movement as a spinoff of the anti-slavery movement. They regarded the 15th Amendment as unconstitutional, insisting Congress had violated the Constitution by forcing this on these southern states during Reconstruction, going beyond its original powers, violating states' rights. They were trying to figure out how to keep African American men from voting without violating the 14th or 15th Amendments and thus being punished by Congress. So white suffragists came up with a Southern strategy to convince Southern white politicians that they should not take the vote away from black men, which would risk having their delegations to Congress cut back. Instead, they argued, just enfranchise women. Since there were more white women in the South than the North, hey, that would guarantee white supremacy. In places where there were black majorities, where the black population was unevenly distributed, as it was in most of the South, you could counter this with educational or property requirements to ensure that most women voters would be white. The very first place that they tried this was the 1895 Constitutional Convention in South Carolina. National leaders worked with Virginia Young, the editor of the Fairfax Enterprise, who, like many late 19th century suffragists, had come to the movement through the Woman's Christian Temperance Union. Virginia Young founded the South Carolina Equal Rights Association in 1890. Historian Barbara Bellows, well known to all of you, did her master's thesis years ago on Virginia Young. At the convention, Laura Clay spoke. She deplored the problems confronting the entire nation owing to the, quote, rash prodigality with which the franchise has been extended to all classes of men, regardless of their unfitness for such political trust by illiteracy, foreign birth, or other causes, unquote. You could almost hear that in some of the politics of today. She urged South Carolina to set an example for the entire nation by extending the vote to qualified women and assuring white supremacy through a method that was legal, fair, honest, quote unquote, and unlikely to be struck down by the courts. The suffragists actually gained a fair amount of support from many men of their race and class, including Robert Hemphill of Abbeville and his brother James, editor of the Charleston News and Courier, and George D. Tillman, the brother of Benjamin Tillman. But South Carolina's suffrage campaign ultimately failed because the convention, as you all know, was controlled by the other Tillman brother, Pitchfork, Ben Tillman, who, with his followers, were not about to support a suffrage bill that would not only disqualify black voters, but many women from illiterate families that supported him. Southern suffragists actually deluded themselves into thinking that this strategy, this was an expediency argument that might work, that it might convince Southern men to actually lead the nation in the adoption of women's suffrage. But as we know, it did not. As one white Mississippi politician said, Southern men refused to cower behind petticoats and use lovely womanhood to maintain white supremacy. Instead, they found other means to do so that did not involve the destruction of women's traditional role by adopting additional requirements for voting, such as poll taxes, literacy tests, or understanding clauses. Alas, Congress and the Supreme Court let them get away with it, both then and for another half century. For the rest of the suffrage movement, the South would continue to be a problem, and white suffragists would continue to make concessions to Southern racism. White suffragists distanced themselves from association with black suffragists and black suffrage. As the movement got underway among a few white women in this state, they never mentioned the work of the Grimkes or the Rollins sisters. The interracial quality of the original movement was virtually lost. Some of the older suffragists who had fought against slavery had now died. Other younger women came into the movement. Some interracial friendships survived, others did not. White suffragists, however, I hasten to say, they were not all the same exactly on race. Some were extreme racists to oppose blacks ever voting. Others saw literacy tests as okay, since the nation had public schools, and in time, all blacks would learn to read. Others hated to compromise their values, but they did so anyway, knowing that at this period in American history, their movement was never going to succeed if suffrage leaders and organizations openly advocated for equal suffrage for African Americans. It was a strange parallel to what happened after the Civil War, when supporters of African American suffrage believed they had no chance of victory if women's suffrage was included. However, despite all of this and their disappointment in so many white women, African American women saw this as their cause too. They continued to support the movement, mostly working through the growing number of African American women's clubs that were flourishing during this period, or in separate suffrage organizations. Prominent African American suffragists were many, including Ida B. Wells Barnett, who became internationally famous as a crusader against lynching, and also very prominent Mary Church Terrell, the Oberlin-educated, cosmopolitan, European-educated woman who founded the National Association of Colored Women. She was one of the few African-American women allowed to address the National Organization's convention, even chosen to represent American women at an international conference in Berlin, where, by the way, she addressed the audience in fluent German. So what happened? How did the movement finally win? As the new century began, the movement seemed stalled. Anthony had retired, then died, a suffrage martyr, and the woman in charge for most of this period, Dr. Anna Howard Shaw, a great orator, was not a brilliant strategist. The movement was highly decentralized, lots of isolated state campaigns that failed. Still, suffragists were working steadily to grow their constituency, reaching out to college women, to working women, to women of many ethnic groups, at the same time that they were giving the back of their hand to African American women. They were reaching out to wealthy women philanthropists who helped fund the movement as well as shed its radical image. Suffrage leaders also reached out to the growing number of middle and upper class women involved in women's clubs. Many of them were supporters of a new reform movement that in the early 1900s was sweeping the nation, the progressive movement, which had a major and positive impact on the women's suffrage movement and contributed greatly to its victory. Increasingly, larger numbers of women wanted the vote to gain reforms, and this motivated male reformers and politicians who wanted their help. It also provided the movement with a new and powerful expediency argument. By 1910, the progressive movement, which had begun around 1900 at the grassroots level and swept both national parties, contributed greatly to success of women's suffrage. We associated, of course, with Republican President Theodore Roosevelt and Democratic President Woodrow Wilson. Progressives in both parties wanted to see stronger, honest government that would act boldly to address major problems. They supported reforms to clean up city, state, and national politics and protect the health and safety of the citizens. And in all sections of the U.S., including the South, the women's suffrage movement drew support from men and women who supported progressive reforms such as abolishing child labor, protecting women workers, promoting public health programs, and legislation to curb political corruption. In fact, large corporations, party bosses, etc., who relied on corrupting politicians to succeed, were terrified that women would clean up politics if allowed to enter the bachelor's club of politics. I think it's quite interesting that the goals of the progressive movement fit perfectly with the prevailing ideas about woman's nature at the time. Though by this time, more women had advanced education and worked outside the home, most women did not. And ideas about woman's nature remained surprisingly the same. Progressives believed that women tended to be more nurturing, compassionate, and honest, and would vote for a stronger, more compassionate government that would enact progressive reforms. Suffragists not being dummies, capitalized on this in their promotional literature. This is a very important point, key to understanding the suffrage victory. And I argue in One Woman, One Vote that women won the vote not because women's ideas about women's nature had changed, not nearly as important as that Americans changed their ideas about the nature and purpose of government. Wanting government to be what they thought women would support, more compassionate, more protective, more moral. Beginning in 1910, at the height of the progressive movement, the suffrage movement just took off. Increased support resulting from the progressive movement and a new set of victories beginning in the western states seemed to breathe new life into the suffragists all over America. The Nationals still faced tough battles in the Northeast, including New York and New Jersey, and had secured no victories in the South. Most suffrage leaders believed they had not yet reached that magic moment where they had enough states to win the Congress or ratification. But some suffragists started to get impatient, saying, let's just drop all these state work and go back to the militant strategy of the 1870s. Let's focus on getting that federal amendment exclusively. This is the point of view of a young woman named Alice Paul, I'm sure you've all heard of, who soon emerged as leader of the so-called militant suffragists and caught the attention of the nation in the 1920s. She came back to the United States in 1910 after being influenced by the suffragists she met as a political science graduate student studying in London. Paul admired the militant spirit of the British suffragettes, whose real name was the Women's Social and Political Union. Please remember that in the United States, suffragists did not call themselves suffragettes. This was used only by the anti-suffragists in this country to belittle them, ridicule them, diminish them. Please never call them that, no matter how many times you see politicians in the press doing so. Just tell them they're wrong and move on, okay? Tactfully. Paul demonstrated with them and went to jail. Paul first worked with the National, including organizing this famous, spectacular suffrage march you've probably heard of in Washington, D.C., with somewhere between 5,000 and 8,000 women on the eve of Woodrow Wilson's inauguration. He arrived at the station and asked everybody, where are the crowds? And they said, they were watching the suffragists, I guess. They represented their group or in costumes of their national background or otherwise wearing white, took part. And here you see an actual photo alongside the TV program, the film Iron-Jawed Angels, which I worked with and I would really recommend to you. A great film starring Hilary Swank as Alice Paul. Unfortunately, men in the crowd, many of them drunk and hostile to the suffragists, attacked the marchers. But and this meant pelting them with empty liquor bottles, cigars, all of this, and charging them, ripping down their banners, their sashes, and beating them up, and some fights broke out. It was horrible. But to Paul's delight, this led to increased sympathy for the movement, especially with members of Congress whose wives and sisters and daughters were among those attacked. The press became more sympathetic, though not so much in the South. The Birmingham Ledger, for example, defended the crowd that contained lots of Southern men there to cheer on Woodrow Wilson, and saying, quote, our suffrage sisters must understand that when they cut away from the conventions of the ages, they venture into untried fields, and many will find rude men. And the disorder is what the suffragettes should have anticipated. A majority of men, said the Birmingham paper, still disapprove of the movement and the very ideas underlying it and are not always considerate in expressing their disapproval. Many Southerners and folks from across the nation were even more outraged when the suffragists began to picket the White House. National leaders included, saying this was is very uncommon in those days, certainly shocking that it was being done by women. So by 1914, there was another schism in the ranks of the movement because of differences in approach, and the militants founded the National Woman's Party. The most shocking thing they did, of course, was to picket the White House even after the U.S. entered World War I, and criticism of the president and the government was not tolerated. You see here with their most inflammatory act, calling him Kaiser Wilson, which led to soldiers and sailors attacking them and tearing down their signs. It also led the Wilson administration to throw a lot of the suffragists in jail, where they served long sentences. Some went on hunger strikes, were forcibly fed. This was done by shoving feeding tube down a nostril, using a funnel, then pouring soup or raw eggs into them, which often caused bleeding or nausea. Once again, a South Carolinian, Anita Politzer, played a role in the suffrage movement. She was one of Alice Paul's key aides. She was very active in the National Woman's Party near the end of the struggle, later served as the chair of the National Woman's Party between 1945 and 49, where she was a leader of the fight for the Equal Rights Amendment. When the prisoners were released, she arranged to rent a train car decorated as the prison special, tour the nation where the women would get out in their prison outfits and lecture to the crowd. First stop, Charleston, South Carolina. Attractive and confident and able to use her Southern charm very effectively, Anita was there when someone needed to be persuaded. She was one of the three Politzer sisters, Anita, Carrie, and Mabel of Charleston, the other two sisters working mainly within the state and on a range of women's causes. The eldest, Carrie, was active in the National Woman's Party, worked with Susan Pringle Frost, and who was the chair of the NWP in the state. Mabel, a science teacher at Memminger High School, served as the chair of the state chapter and helped to found Free Public Library in Charleston. She was still writing letters in favor of the Equal Rights Amendment when she was age 93. Politzer House is still there. Okay, nearing the end. I'm going too long here, and I apologize for that. Meanwhile, the National continued its work under this woman, Carrie Chapman Catt. After she served as national president for 4 years between Anthony and Shaw, resigned because of her husband's illness, she then became founder and president of the International Women's Suffrage Alliance and traveled all over the world promoting women's enfranchisement. She returned to the national presidency in 1915. The skillful general of the movement immediately launched her so-called winning plan, which coordinated efforts across the nation, worked hard to secure Wilson's support, and ran a massive lobbying effort to enlist congressional support. As the nation entered World War I, seeking to gain favor with the public and Wilson, she pushed aside her own pacifism and urged suffragists to throw themselves into war work, even funding a woman's overseas hospital in France. Finally, they persuaded Wilson to endorse the federal amendment, a huge victory. He addressed Congress in 1918 asking them to enfranchise women in recognition of their war service. They still had to win over a handful of senators more, and their biggest problem, you guessed it, was the continued opposition of the South. And Northern and Western supporters in Congress increasingly accused Southern Democrats of being reactionaries who could only hope to delay the success of a movement whose time had come. Southern Democrats, on the other hand, saw themselves as keepers of tradition, level-headed conservatives who would save the United States from this fad that was sweeping the nation. Benjamin Tillman was the classic example, assailing his colleagues from the floor of the Senate for acting too hastily, for giving in to these women, for yielding to the pressures of their party, and failing to stand up against these suffragists. The now aged senator who had helped quash the suffrage movement in 1895 in the state, now pleaded with his, quote, rash young colleagues, unquote, to be counseled and directed by, quote, the wisdom of their seniors, unquote, rather than rush, quote, pell-mell, helter-skelter into women's suffrage. Congress should gather statistics and suffrage states of the birth rate, death rate, divorces, and other things affecting the everyday social life of the people, which would in 100 years, say, show us whether female suffrage had attracted these things injuriously or not. Men from other parts of the nation, he said, should heed the example of the South, particularly South Carolina, where the institutions regarding the relations between the sexes were beyond reproach. Traditional laws and customs, he said, such as its lack of divorce, that would enable men to tire of their skinny and shrunken wives and go after some young and buxom girl. This was all on the floor of the Senate, in the Congressional Minute. Or lynching, he said, which makes it dangerous to monkey with men's womankind. He also defended the unwritten law, which allowed men to shoot men who slept with their wives and daughters and go unpunished. He called this the best law to protect woman's virtue I ever heard of. Fortunately for the suffragists, he died in July 1918, leading them all to conclude that God is a woman. And his replacement was a suffrage sympathizer, William Pollock of Cheraw. Which they then chose to speak to the nation. I will skip over that. But for the most part, they still had terrible problems gaining the remaining votes that they needed. Despite the pandemic, which made it very difficult, they still managed, however, to win a few other supporters in different parts of the country and to finally gain the votes they needed, and Congress at last had the 2/3 in each house that they needed. It was then sent to the states, and once again, the struggle was sectional, with Illinois, Wisconsin competing to be the first to ratify, and Georgia and Alabama competing to be the first to pass a rejection resolution denouncing the Susan B. Anthony Amendment as unwarranted, unnecessary, and dangerous. That's Anita Politzer, third from the right. Invoking their Confederate ancestors, many Southern legislatures vowed to fight to the end against this incursion into the rights of states. When Mississippi declined it, the paper celebrated the defeat, saying, now this vile old amendment is as dead as its author, Susan B. Anthony, the advocate of social equality and intermarriage, and Mississippi will never be annoyed with it again. South Carolina did not ratify, despite the best efforts of suffragists in the state, including Eulalie Sally, whom you met, and who was the primary leader of the South Carolina Equal Suffrage League, a national affiliate. Some of you may know or have read that her interest in women's rights was sparked by the case involving Lucy Pickens Dugas Tillman, the wife of Ben Tillman Jr., whose husband had her 2 young daughters deeded away to his parents while she was ill. Case involving 2 of the most powerful families in the state, made it all the way to the Supreme Court. Women from all over the state poured in to observe. It was so crowded, they had to delay the opening. Women forced to stand in the lobby so they could hear. You can read all about this in Volume 2 of South Carolina Women, Their Lives and Times by Michelle Coffey. Sally was an aggressive and innovative campaigner, organizing suffrage parades like this one in Aiken County. Thanks to Todd for this wonderful picture. She knew and greatly admired Carrie Chapman Catt, strongly disapproved of the unladylike tactics of the militants, and national affiliates in the state tried to overcome the image of the movement as too radical or a threat to Southern civilization. On one of these floats in one of the parades, it said on the side, "For the health of the nation, give women the vote. The hand that rocks the cradle will never rock the boat." Okay. South Carolina did not ratify, however, until 1969. At that time, Eulalie Sally, then 85, was invited to stand behind the governor while he finally signed the 19th Amendment into law, and Keller then made them finally send in the paperwork, which they forgot to do for ages. She took the occasion to scold the Democrats by pointing out it took a Republican senator to ensure the amendment was finally approved, saying, "Boys, I've been waiting 50 years to tell you what I think of you." Okay. Returning to the ratification fight, summer of 1920, only one more state was needed. Wilson pressured poor governor of Tennessee to bring it on to Tennessee. He did. They pleaded with him, final battle in Nashville. Alice Paul knows she should not go, but she sends Anita Politzer, who then really lobbies very effectively once again. Tennessee passes, but only because this young man, 24 years old, from the mountains, got a letter from his mother saying, "Harry, if it comes down to you, do the right thing and help Mrs. Catt put the rat in ratification." The next day, while the nation people are celebrating, they had this picture out front in which they thanked, the suffragists thanked these men who had made the key difference. There in the middle you see Anita in the black dress, Harry gazing at her, and the whole nation is saying Harry's mother saved the day. The Politzer family, according to Amy McCandless, says, no, it was Anita who had dinner with him the night before. You can believe what you want, but I will say that what is that the movie called? The truth is in the eyes. What is it? But just take a look at Harry. Okay, so the women got the right to vote finally. And however, it was a very incomplete victory. As the adoption of the 19th Amendment in 1920 was a huge deal. Millions and millions more women enfranchised. The largest expansion at a single time in our country's history, basically doubling the eligible voters. It was not a complete victory because many women remained disfranchised. All American women who were citizens were enfranchised, but not all would be allowed to use it. Outside the South, African American women voted in large numbers. Inside the South, they tried to vote in large numbers, including some wonderful stories about what happened right here in Columbia. But very quickly, as many had predicted and as the white suffragists had promised, all of those kinds of disfranchising laws were quickly adopted to apply to women as well. And that situation continued for almost half a century. As we know, a major goal of the civil rights movement of the 60s was to remove those barriers. And again, many women, such as the great Fannie Lou Hamer of Mississippi and Septima Clark of this state, were active in that movement to gain voting, the right to use the vote that they had under the Constitution. And at last, in 1965, with the Voting Rights Act of 1965, they finally got that. Because what it did essentially was to enforce, at long last, both the 15th and the 19th Amendments. And it drastically changed American politics. Before the Voting Rights Act, an estimated 23% of black voters of voting age were registered nationally. But by 1969, 61% had registered, and the number then climbed. And over time, African American women would prove to be the nation's most devoted voters, turning out in large numbers at every election. Unfortunately, in 2013, the Supreme Court ruled that a key part of that act was unconstitutional. This is the Shelby versus Holder decision. Assuming that in the age of Obama, when Americans had elected an African American president, that federal protection of minority voting rights was no longer needed. This was, as we have seen, a huge mistake. The late Ruth Bader Ginsburg knew that, wrote the dissent, saying that weakening an essential part of the Voting Rights Act when it had worked so well to stop discrimination was, quote, like throwing away your umbrella in a rainstorm because you are not getting wet. In many states, serious voter suppression began almost immediately, inspiring vigorous efforts by a new generation of voting rights activists such as Stacey Abrams, picking up the fight that had once been led by the suffragists and later by the rights of Hamer and the great John Lewis, who was nearly beaten to death on the bridge in Selma in 1965. May we have a new voting rights law in his memory and preferably in his name. Even as we celebrate the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment in 2020, in the midst of a fierce election, we have learned more than ever to appreciate that right. And as we have learned more about the history of the movement, we have learned that equal access to the polls was hard to gain, and once gained, must be protected and defended. The suffrage movement, perhaps, is never over. But at last this lecture is, and I am eager to hear your thoughts and questions. And as I close, let me just show you this picture and return to August 26, 1920, the day the 19th Amendment was victorious. In her prepared message Kat delivered that day, rather than thanking the President, members of Congress, or state legislators, she directed her remarks to the women of America, reminding them of the 72 years of struggle by generations of suffragists and the many sacrifices made so that, quote, you and your daughters might inherit political freedom. That vote, she said, has been costly. Prize it. I know I speak for all of us when I say we do. Thank you. That was